Many of you know Erskine already. His big claim to fame is his marriage to Nan. He also has two wonderful daughters, and he's so lucky. They and their families live in the area, so that's just was a sweet lure for him to retire here. I would like to tell you a little bit more about Erskine. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and went to undergrad school at University of South Carolina. Then he went to Columbia for his MDiv and got his PhD at Union Presbyterian Seminary. His main career has been at Columbia Seminary, where he is Professor Emeritus of U.S. History, and his main focus has been on enslaved people, race, and religion. He's lectured all over the country and all over the world, and we're just so lucky to have him. It's something new and exciting that's happening. He's published many books, but this is called The Dwelling Place. And it's sort of an upstairs, downstairs story about a series of plantations in Georgia. And we call them plantations, but recently I saw where people said, there were forced labor camps. And that was kind of stunning to think about all the forced labor camps that were in the South. He knows a lot about them. But this book has recently inspired a new opera called Castor and Patience, and it will debut, hopefully, if COVID lets us, this summer at Cincinnati Opera. So that's pretty thrilling. But we're so fortunate to have Erskine. Thank you for being here tonight.
So, what I want to do this afternoon is to look at this great part of our history and the way in which, with some reflections on the way in which it continues to impact our lives and the life of the nation. That is, to look at race and slavery, and particularly the way in which our Presbyterian ancestors in the 19th century responded to that great question, those great questions. Both our white ancestors, Presbyterian ancestors, and our black African-American Presbyterian ancestors. I'm going to focus on Presbyterians, especially those in Charleston, South Carolina, because Charleston was not only by far the wealthiest city in the country until the Civil War, but it was also a cultural center of the South, and it was the port of entry for some 40% of Africans and those who became African Americans. And it had a very influential Presbyterian community. I'll go out a bit from Charleston, but we're going to spend some time looking at that. But first, a little context. Slavery as an institution, as a practice, is a worldwide phenomenon. The enslavement of people in the ancient world was widespread, and it has been widespread on each continent. The largest societies that were slave-owning societies were China and India, and it's no surprise there given the size of those countries. But you can think of other places as well, large slave societies in world history: the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Aztecs, the Ashanti, all slave societies are societies marked by the enslavement of people. The word slave itself comes from the word Slav. Interesting at this moment to think about that. That is Slavic people who were enslaved and brought into the Ottoman Empire. So it has been a widespread practice. But our concern has to do, first of all, with the transatlantic slave trade, beginning in the 16th century and ending really late in the 19th century. During that period of time, about 11 million Africans were captured and brought to what was called the New World, to the Western Hemisphere. The largest number went to Brazil. Some 5 million were carried to Brazil. The British Caribbean, British Jamaica and Barbados and other smaller islands, about 1.5 million. The same with the French Caribbean, especially with Haiti, which was a producer of enormous wealth for the French, about 1.5, and with the Spanish a little less. Of those 11 million, approximately 450,000 to 500,000 came to what is today the United States. So you can see that there was a huge difference in the numbers that were brought. The slave population in the U.S., however, in contrast especially to the Caribbean or anywhere where there were these large sugar plantations or enslavement camps, the enslaved population in what is today the U.S. was able to reproduce itself naturally. That is, it grew naturally, so that by the time of the beginning of the 19th century, there were as many African Americans in the U.S. as there were in the British Caribbean. The conditions in the Caribbean, and also in Brazil for that matter, were so horrific that the average lifespan of an enslaved person was about 7 years. So there had to be this constant introduction of more and more Africans in order to keep those plantations going. For a variety of social and environmental reasons, as I've said, the population here was able to grow naturally. By the way, by 1710, the number of African Americans, that is, people who were born in the British North American colonies, exceeded the number of Africans, that is, people who were born in Africa and who had been brought to what is today the U.S. That means that very, very early, a distinct African American culture began to develop. That was before our Scotch-Irish ancestors began to come in any number to the British colonies. So this distinct African American culture reaches deep into our history. Now, Charleston was a port of entry, as I've said, for approximately 40% of the Africans who were brought to the U.S. But shipping interest in the northern colonies and later the states played a large role in the trade. Rhode Island, in particular, was a center of the international slave trade, but Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, too, were centers of ship ownership that was involved in the slave trade. The largest number of ships were from Liverpool that were part of the international slave trade to British North America and then the U.S. But Bristol and London also were very important. Now, as we think about that and as we move into the 19th century and the story we want to engage with this afternoon, it's important to remember that these numbers are not simply statistics, but they represent men, women, and children. And we can think of the horrors that the children and others are facing in the Ukraine today, and see in that a kind of distant echo of some of the horrors that the African captives faced. Now, after the American Revolution, the international slave trade was largely closed in most parts of the U.S. But in 1804, between 1804 and 1808, the state of South Carolina reopened the slave trade. And that is, it allowed slave ships to come in. And during that 4-year period, approximately 70,000 Africans were brought to Charleston. It's stunning to think of that and of the number of people involved in it. So, to give you an example, the ship Harriet left Charleston, arrived in Gambia. The captain purchased 70 enslaved Africans, a Captain Welch. He then left and went to Goree, this small island you may know of. It was a large place for holding Africans for the slave trade. So after that, he set sail and headed to Charleston. There was a 39-day middle passage. During that time, the 70 enslaved Africans, 8 died, probably from dysentery or dehydration, or the trauma and brutality of the trip. Turned into the Ashley River. Those of you who know Charleston, the Ashley, and he didn't go immediately to the wharfs where the slaves were sold, but went to a pest house on James Island, and there they had to wait 10 days before they could go around to the wharfs. When they got to Craft's Wharf on the Cooper River, that is, they sailed back around the peninsula and came in. Craft's Wharf, those of you who know Charleston know the Adger wharfs. They're very expensive condominiums that are there now. But it was the receiving place for many, many Africans. And that's a part of the history there. In 4 years, 70,000 Africans. And think of how many sailing ships that took. And so many who died on the way, but also once they got there, because they were held in the ships, many died there. And the captains just took the bodies out and put them in the streets or in vacant lots, and the famous Charleston buzzards came. Some threw them into the water, in the harbor there, these bodies, and it was reported that the affluent whites of Charleston stopped eating fish during this period of time. And so that was the story, that was the event that this period of 4 years that helped to shape much of the character of the city during the coming years. There was this huge demand for Africans at this time because of the spreading cotton. As cotton moved west into middle Georgia, to upstate South Carolina, into middle Georgia, into Alabama and Mississippi, and remember the Louisiana Purchase. Even people coming into Charleston were shipped from there to New Orleans, or went across country marched across country there. Now, during the early years, there were major slave revolts in the British Caribbean, in Jamaica, and then there was the Haitian Revolution, which was about 10 years in a 10-year period. And that revolution, it was the one successful slave revolution in world history. The British and the French armies were both defeated, and largely by the black rebels, but also by yellow fever and malaria. But that revolution traumatized white Americans, and the one of the main themes of U.S. history is the fear that whites have had of black rage and the way in which it might explode like the Haitian Revolution exploded is a major, major theme of U.S. history. Now, with that background, I want to look most specifically, beginning to look at some of the Presbyterian elements of this in Charleston. In 1818, a black free person of color who had gained his freedom by winning the lottery, and he bought his freedom from his enslaver. His name was Denmark Vesey, and in 1818 he came down out of the balcony of Second Presbyterian Church in Charleston, where he'd been worshiping for some time. He took a right at the bottom of the steps and went a little distance and then went down this very broad aisle where in front of him the long communion table was set. Whites had already come and sat at the table, had turned in their silver communion tokens, sat at the table, and had been served. He came and was received into the church at Second. He became a communicant member of Second Presbyterian. Most people who attended Presbyterian churches until after the Civil War in the South were not communicant members. They were regular and all, but they had not had a religious experience, and so they came to church but could not come to the communion table. But Denmark Vesey had had such an experience, and he came to the table and was a member there. In 1822, a Charleston enslaved person met another one on near the Cooper River and asked him, "Do you know what's a foot in Charleston?" And he said, "No, I don't." And then he said, "Well, there is a plot to overthrow the whites in Charleston and for us to have our freedom." And at least that was the way the story was told. The story, the one who heard the story reported it to his owner, and very complicated story follows, but the whites became alarmed and were convinced that a major plot, and they had in the background the Haitian Revolution, what happened in Jamaica and Barbados and other places, and Louisiana. There had been a major slave revolt in Louisiana in 1810. At any rate, they were convinced, and they began arresting people, and they took them to, they started interviewing them, and they took them to the workhouse in Charleston, where white Charlestonians could send enslaved people that they wanted to be whipped. They did not want to whip a servant in behind their garden walls in Charleston, where neighbors could hear the groans and agony of those being whipped. So for $5 or $10, you could send, depending on how long they stayed there and how many lashes they got. So they put these, no women were arrested. Very interesting, as if whites thought that black women were incapable of plotting a revolution. At any rate, they took them there. Their hands were tied behind their back. Their feet were tied to the hands were tied to a rope, and their feet were tied to the floor, and then the rope was pulled through a pulley, and their hands were stretched up. They were stripped and whipped, and some were sent to solitary confinement, which was like being buried alive. It was a dreadful, dreadful place. So a small group began to confess that they, in fact, had been a part of it. About 5 men made these confessions, and they accused others of being involved in this attempted the scare of an attempted revolution in Charleston. So if you know Charleston, 35 men were taken down Meeting Street past Second Presbyterian Church to an area that was called the Lines. And there they rode on their own coffins, and there they were placed on a bench and executed by hanging. It took about 10 to 15 minutes for a person to die, because it was basically strangulation at that point in the way hanging worked. And they were surrounded by many people, including the women who were there. So one of the persons who saw this was 12-year-old John Adger, who would later become a leader in the Southern Presbyterian Church, and we'll speak of him in a minute about the attempts that he made to negotiate what it meant to be a white Christian in Charleston. What the Denmark Vesey insurrection or scare, and it's a huge debate among historians whether there was actually an attempt at an insurrection, or whether it was mainly just rumors among blacks, but that it was really a white scare that was what it was. That whites were basically hysterical about the possibilities of an insurrection. So the Denmark Vesey event is a good place to look at the way whites were to try to deal with what they saw as the threat of blacks. And again, I want to emphasize this constant theme, really throughout U.S. history, of white fear of blacks, especially black rage that might come breaking out of a largely hidden black world beyond the eyes of whites. On the one hand, there were whites who said that this is such a severe threat to our society and to whites that it has to be met with great violence. So military, police, mob violence has been one major response to the threat of blacks that whites perceived. Again, growing out of this constant theme of fear of blacks. And we can see how that is going to continue. That idea that violence is necessary to keep blacks in their place. And that is the big concern. How can we keep blacks in their place? There was another approach that was beginning to emerge, and that is an approach that generally falls under the rubric of paternalism. And what was needed, white paternalists said, was for blacks to come to believe that it was their God-given duty to be obedient. That what was needed was for an internal change in the heart of the enslaved, a change that would inculcate a spirit of submission. So if black Charlestonians were led to believe that obedience to white Charlestonians was a religious duty, an obligation owed to God, then white Charleston would be safe, less troubled by nightmares of unreleased rage, and the city's beauty and its wealth could be more fully enjoyed. if such submission were internalized, then black Charlestonians would think like slaves, would act like slaves, and would be slaves. Now, Presbyterians were not only largely paternalistic, but the most prominent paternalistic people, not only in Charleston, but throughout the South. This paternalism seemed to be a kind of middle way. What Presbyterians love the middle. They're afraid of going too far to one side or the other. And it's not simply, it sometimes is, but it's most sophisticated. It's not simply a kind of pragmatic way, but it's the belief that virtue and truth and the right path lie in the middle. Prudence is a great Presbyterian virtue. So these, my daughters never like me to say that to them. They say now they hate the word prudence. Anyway, and probably for good reason. But anyway, these white Presbyterians were known as great paternalists. The most famous was not in Charleston, but in Georgia. Charles Calker Jones, the one from this book, Dwelling Place, he's a central character in that. He was known as among whites as the apostle to the Negro slave, because he tried to emphasize that whites needed to be kind to blacks and to see that they had good food, good housing, families stay together, and so on. Now, Charleston Presbyterians were leaders in a great experiment in paternalism. And in the 1840s, this John Adger, who had seen the execution of the blacks at the time of the Denmark Feast, he made a proposal that there be a new work in Charleston by the Presbyterians that would try to reach the black Charlestonians. He'd been a missionary, and he'd come home from what is today Turkey, and he preached a very important sermon called with the theme, "The Poor Have the Gospel Preached Unto Them." And he asked in the sermon, who are the poor of Charleston? And he said they're easily distinguished. And I'm going to read a little bit of it, because it catches more than any other thing that I know of the spirit of paternalism among white Presbyterians. They are a class separated from ourselves by their color, their position in society, their relation to our families, their national origin, and their moral, intellectual, and physical condition. Nowhere are the poor so closely and intimately connected with the higher classes as are our poor with us. Now think of Charleston with the arrangement of housing there, where blacks live very close, right behind the house, those big Charleston houses. They are divided out among us and mingle up with us, and we with them in 1,000 ways. They live with us, eating from the same storehouse, drinking from the same fountains, dwelling in the same enclosures, forming parts of the same families. Our mothers confine us when infants to their arms, and sometimes to the very milk of their breast. Their children are, to some extent, unavoidably the playmates of our children, of our childhood. They grow up with us under the same roof, sometimes pass through all the changes of life with us, and then either they stand weeping by our bedside, or else we drop a tributary tear by theirs, when death comes to close the long connection and to separate the good master and his good servant. It's a very moving sermon for its eloquence. He says, they are our poor brethren, children of our God and Father, dear to our Savior, to the like of whom he preached, to the like of whom he died, and to the least of whom every act of Christian compassion and kindness which we show, he will consider as shown also to us. And he he said in that they had been brought to us in the mystery of God's providence. He brought all those slave ships there, including the work that his father did as a very prominent merchant, not engaged directly in the slave trade, but a very prominent merchant. So a church was started with Adja money, largely. It was the largest church building in Charleston. It was built on the corner of what is today Calhoun and Meeting. It was a huge building, and there were a few whites that belonged to that church, but the blacks flocked to it. It was known as Zion, and the whites had to sit in the balcony, and the blacks on the main floor. So it was this great reversal that was taking place there, though the whites were still in charge. During the Civil War and after the Civil War, Zion will be a center of black life in Charleston because of its size and because of its reputation of what this concern for what was called the religious instruction of the enslaved, and because it was much more what we would say today progressive than any of the other churches in Charleston. Even the Methodists, and the Methodists were overwhelmingly black. By 1850, about 800 whites belonged to the Methodist Church in Charleston, about 7,000 blacks. But nevertheless, this was a part of this paternalistic ideal, and it played itself out. The good intentions of white Presbyterians. Now, how did black Presbyterians respond? There were a number of very prominent black Presbyterians that came out of Charleston and that would have an important influence, and they came out of Second Presbyterian too. William Cato, it's too long a story for me to tell, but he ended up as the pastor. He was in Charleston, he was a member of Second, was a leader in the black community, in the black membership at Second. He ended up going to Philadelphia and was pastor, first African Baptist there, quite involved with the Underground Railroad and other things. His son, Octavius Cato, grew up in Second Church. When his father left, he went with him. In the election of 1876, very contested election, he had been very much involved for the rights of blacks to vote. And he was walking down the street in Philadelphia, and a white Democrat, those blacks were Republicans, a white Democrat saw him, and he walked past him, and he turned around and shot him and killed him in the back. Shot him in the back and killed him. 5 years ago, his statue was erected in front of the City Hall in Philadelphia. Very quickly, Francis Cardozo, member of Second, free black, with Adja and Smythe help at Second Church, he was able to go to the University of Edinburgh. He graduated. After the Civil War, he came back to Charleston, was a leader in education, was the Secretary of State for South Carolina during Reconstruction, a Presbyterian minister. Perhaps the most important was Francis Grimke, a really incredible story of the Grimke brothers, very prominent Huguenot ancestry, but they were persons of color. Their aunts were Angelina and Sarah Grimke, the great abolitionist and feminist who left Charleston and fought against slavery. But there were two brothers, one Archibald, who they were able, after the Civil War, to go to Lincoln, a largely Presbyterian school in Pennsylvania. And Archibald went on to Harvard Law, and Francis became a Presbyterian minister at 15th Street Church in Washington, and was called the Black Puritan, and a remarkable man, and quite a story. connected with him. Now, all of these black leaders who were Presbyterian emphasized in a very Presbyterian way the importance of education. I've mentioned the role of Cardozo, but all of them emphasized that. And after the Civil War, what you see is black Presbyterians saying that the way out of oppression is to get an education for blacks. And they began to form schools. There were over 50 Presbyterian schools in the state by 1920. And they like on Edisto Island, the Larimer School there, it was the center of the community. It was very strong Presbyterian. You'd have other schools, Johns Island, James Island. Some of you will know Coulter Memorial in Sherraw, Harbinson in Irmo. And then there were these boarding schools that the African American Presbyterians formed. Emmanuel Institute in Aiken, Brainerd Institute in Chester, and then Coulter in Irmo. Those were boarding schools. And so someone would come from Edisto Island, from the Larimer School, then they would go to the boarding school, say in Aiken, and then, if they were able to, they would go to Charlotte, to Johnson C. Smith, which was the jewel in the crown for this dense network. And think about that. All those schools, most of them was very small, but that was the way forward. Now, finally, about the response of white Presbyterians after the Civil War. And the best example of the strategy that white Presbyterians proposed and followed for several generations was spelled out by John Lafayette Girardeau, and when the Confederate dead from Gettysburg were brought back to Charleston and were interred at Magnolia Cemetery there. And he said, we must, let me get it exactly how he used it. We must cling to our identity as a people. So there was this anxiety that whites were going to somehow lose their identity because of what was taking place during Reconstruction. And this sermon, this address, spelled out some ways for whites to maintain their identity. And among the ways was how we tell our story and the books that are allowed to be read in our schools and the way in which we are to write the history of the South. We are to write it in a way that glorifies the South. So this nostalgia about the Old South will become a key element in the effort to keep blacks in their place. And it will parallel the violence that will be expressed with the lynching and the re-enslavement of people with chain gangs and so on, and the role of the police and the military and all of that. So the story in the 20th century, if you want to hear the more positive side of Presbyterian struggling, and I must say that, struggling with these questions, I must say that these people that I've mentioned, with the exception of Girardeau, whom I don't really like, they are people that I've come to admire greatly, except they had these deep blind spots. They just didn't see the way in which their own self-interest was rooted in keeping blacks in their place. And so the 20th century, we have two movie stars right here on the front row. But the story that Carolyn Crowder has told are allowed to be heard of whites trying to stand for justice, and the really wonderful stories connected, hard stories, but wonderful stories connected with that. Okay, this is a complicated story, but that's one of the ways we defend ourselves, by saying that it's complicated. And but it is complicated, and so part of the task for us, I think, is to look at what is it that shapes our vision of our history and our present responsibilities, and in what ways are we blind to the evil that has been there, and the ways in which our own comfort, and I must say, love of good things, like family, how those have blocked us engaging fully in this side of our story. And it's an ongoing question for us. Okay, I've gone on longer than I intended. Y'all are very patient, and I appreciate you coming.
Dr. Erskine Clarke.